Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about the integumentary system. So we have an integumentary system. What is it? Well, it's made up of several important organs, and principally the largest organ in the entire body, which is the skin. But if the skin isn't enough, we also throw in there hair follicles and sebaceous glands and sweat glands and nails. And so all of these things, skin and its supportive organs make up the integumentary system. And so there's so many cool things about the integumentary system. Its overall function is to protect us from outside environments. It also is a sensory organ in order to pick up cues from the outside, and it's also helpful in sort of regulating temperature. And so all of these things are really important. So the integumentary system. So my approach to this is that I want to talk a little bit about anatomy, and then I'll take you for a tour of each of these organs and discuss physiology. So first thing I want to say is that if you can come up with an analogy, I might describe the skin, which is the largest organ, as something like a cake, where it has this thin frosting on the top called the epidermis. And so the epidermis, the prefix epi means upon or on top of the true skin, which is the dermis. So here we have the epidermis, very, very thin. Here's the dermis, the largest section of the skin. And then below the dermis, we have something called the hypo, which means below or low. So hypodermis. You might recognize this term because if you're ever injected by a needle, like if you're getting a vaccination, for example, you would be using a hypodermic needle. So in other words, you would be penetrating into the dermis below. So the skin is all of these three things. It's epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. And so let's take a look at that. If you also wanted to look at the fact that the dermis is called the cutaneous layer. The dermis can also be called the cutaneous layer. And so if the epidermis is breached, in other words, there's a tear in the epidermis, which there's no blood vessels, and the dermis is penetrated, there will be blood leaking out onto the skin because this is where the blood vessels are contained in the dermis. And so you're said to have had a cut. That's where that comes from, cutaneous, a cut. And then if the dermis is going to be called the cutaneous layer, then below the cutaneous is the subcutaneous or hypodermis. So several words meaning the same thing. So let's take a look. Well, first thing I think of when I see this is that it's really busy, but we can take it apart slowly. I'm just going to walk you through this and then get into each of them. So again, the epidermis is rather thin. It's thin most of the time, but the truth is it can be thick depending on these upper layers. Like the areas like thick epidermis might be found. If I were to ask you to guess, you might say, well, I think I have some pretty thick skin on my hands and on the soles of my feet where there's a lot of abrasion, and that's the case. The dermis is by far the thickest layer, and then the subcutaneous or hypodermis is down below. Well, up above here, we all have hair on our skin. There's hair everywhere on the skin except for a few places, on the nipples or on the lips or on genitalia. So hair is something that helps us to stay warm. It's enabling us, the air, to circulate close to the skin and therefore provide a little bit of warmth. And it also is protection, and it also prevents sweat from dropping down into our eyes, that sort of thing. And so we have hair, we have sweat. Speaking of sweat, we have pores on the skin, which will allow water that comes out of these sweat glands to come up this duct and actually appear on the skin. When the water evaporates, then we'll have evaporative cooling and a feeling of cooling down as a result of that, because the warmest water molecules are leaving. Now this epidermis, though thin, it's made up of a couple of different layers. And so the stratum corneum, it's stratum whatever, but stratum corneum, stratum basal or basal, is the lowest level of the epidermis. And it's what's interesting, I'll get into this a little bit more, but the stratum basale are living cells, the stratum corneum are dead. And then down below you can see here's the capillary. Capillary is the smallest blood vessel. And so there's lots of capillaries in the skin. And that not only delivers nutrient to the skin, but it also helps to, if these capillaries dilate, which means they enlarge, there's a release of heat to the outside, and that's important. See this dermal papillae? These are sort of like these mountains right here of the junction between the epidermis and the dermis. That helps to keep the epidermis in place, roughly speaking. We have a lot of touch receptors. These are nerve endings and sensory neurons that are all over the dermis. We'll be talking about this in a later video about sensory neurons and the sensation of touch. It's one of the senses. There's light touch, and there's deep pressure touch, there's temperature, all kinds of cool things. And you know that when you feel the skin, you can feel light touch or deep touch, and you can feel temperature. And so where the epidermis connects to the dermis is the basement membrane. We also have some glands that are associated. Glands, remember, are a group of cells that secrete. We have some glands that are associated with the hair follicle here, called the sebaceous glands. Those produce oil. We have something called a pili muscle, erector pili muscle. It's smooth muscle, and it's attached to the base of the hair follicle, and it can actually cause the hair to stand up. We might be familiar with that. When our hair rises, or in other animals it's a little bit more pronounced when their hair all fluffs up like that. But it's another way in which it can help to warm us up. And so we have sweat glands, which also are involved in temperature regulation. The hair follicle is sort of like the silo where the hair shaft resides. And then we have all kinds of nerves down and below. And then below the dermis, we have lots of adipose tissue. And again, that functions not only in energy storage, but in this case, it really functions as an insulation, keeping our body warm. And then we have below that, we have more blood vessels, and then we have muscle below the skin. So there you have it. And so here's a simple drawing of the skin. Here's the thin epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Here's the sebaceous glands, the hair follicle. Do you notice the hair follicle is considered to be part of the epidermis? It's the epidermis sort of breaching down into the dermis and even hypodermis. So that's still part of the epidermis right here. And what's fascinating, I mentioned before that a lot of the cells on the top of the epidermis are dead. The hair itself is dead too. It's these epidermal cells that are dead, and they get pushed up, sort of like toothpaste, squeezed from below. These are the cells that are alive down below, and they divide and then push the cells up, and they eventually die as they move up. They move away from the blood supply, and so therefore they die as a result of that. They also fill up with keratin, an important protein that helps to make the hair waterproof. And so the bottom layer of the epidermis is the reproducing cells, the stratum basale, or basal, depending on how you want to pronounce that. It's where the blood vessels are down below. And so these are the cells down here, right on this black layer, that are alive. Better picture coming. So we have this epidermis, which is ultimately made up of stratified squamous, which are, if you recall this from our study of tissue, these are cells that are sort of tile-like, and there's many layers. And the cells are dead. And what's significant about that is that it's important that they are dead, because when they're dead, they form an impenetrable barrier for microorganisms like bacteria to breach it. Likewise, you don't want water to be able to get past the skin as well. And so all of this layer right here of the epidermis, this is the epidermis over here, all of these cells are dead except for this base layer down in here, the stratum basal layer. These are the cells that are alive, and these other ones are dead. Now, what's interesting is, don't get caught up on the anatomy of these different layers of cells, but the uppermost layer is called Stratum Corneum, and then you have Stratum Granulosum, which is right below, Spinuosum, which is even below that. The Stratum Corneum is the cells that you can actually see. And so these are the stratified squamous cells. And I mentioned that they fill up with keratin, now, keratinized, but it's really keratin, which is the protein that fills up these cells, and they actually die from accumulating a lot of it. And these cells are really far away from the blood supply. The blood supply ends in the dermal layer, and so these cells are dead. And so that's kind of interesting. Now, depending on where you are, you can see many layers in the epidermis. Like, for example, this thick skin right here, like, for example, on our palm, you can see a lot of different stratum as you move through like this. And you notice how large the stratum corneum is. And again, this is protection. So the function of the epidermis is protection, prevention of water loss, mechanical injury, that sort of thing, from microorganisms. These are the cells on the very bottom that are actually alive. And when they divide, they move up. And you're like, well, if it keeps dividing, does the cells just get thicker and thicker? Yeah, they do, but these upper layers get sloughed off. And so this is what's happening when we slough off our skin through abrasion. You're releasing the stratum corneum. What's interesting is you may be familiar with calluses. If you are really sloughing off an area and you're really getting a lot of abrasion, then the cells will respond to that and divide even more rapidly, and you'll get even a sort of a protrusion of stratum corneum that we call a callus, which is really hard. It's almost as hard as, like, in some people, not my hand, but some people who are really working very hard have really strong calluses, and they're almost like hooves of a dog. They're like nails, because it's that protein keratin that's filling up in these cells. And so that's kind of interesting. Again, another shot of epidermis right here. This is the epidermis. This is the stratum corneum. This is the basal layer down below. These cells are all dead up here. It's stratified squamous. And then, of course, this is the dermis. You're like, well, what am I looking at here? Well, these are cells that are mainly fibroblast cells in the dermis. And all of this pink sort of swaying material is the protein collagen. A little bit of elastin as well, but mostly collagen found in the dermis. Now, this particular slide that I'm showing you right here doesn't really show a hair follicle or any of the organs that I was discussing earlier, but I kind of like it because it shows the loose connective tissue that is the background of the dermis. It's pretty cool. And then here's the free on the outside. That's how you know it's epithelial tissue, and in this case, stratified squamous. So what's really, I think, interesting is in this bottom cell layer, the stratum basal layer, cells that are alive, you get these specialized cells that appear in the bottom layer, right next to the basement membrane, between the interface between the epidermis and the dermis is the dermis below. These sort of, can you see from this picture, they're slightly brownish in coloration? Yeah, if you think so, you would be right, because these cells are called melanocytes, and here's a picture of one. They kind of have extensions of their cell membrane, giving them kind of a tentacle-like appearance, like an octopus, or a little bit like the dendrites of a neuron. And what happens is these cells, if I can animate this, they produce a brown pigment called melanin right here, and that's why they're called melanocytes. And this pigment, this brown pigment, melanin, helps to attract the ultraviolet rays of the sun. So when the rays of the sun come down, like this melanin picks it up, and it protects the dermis, which is the living cells below. And so it's really great. This is what gives our skin color. There's no one that's really white in coloration. It's always just, it's a matter of you're brown, or you're really brown, or you're extremely brown. Unless you're albino, which then you're not producing any melanin at all, or any pigment like that. And so this melanocyte's function is to absorb the rays of the sun to protect the lower skin. So this melanin is a really important pigment. So another micrograph under the light microscope can really see this. What we're looking at here is the epidermis. Here's the stratum corneum right there. Here's the other stratum of the epidermis. And then look at this brown layer right here. These are the melanocytes. And then, of course, this is the dermis over here. And you can see this is loose connective tissue. Sometimes the melanocyte will take one for the team. In other words, it's struck so much by ultraviolet light that it actually becomes cancerous, and that there's potentially a mutation that occurs, and the cell gets caught into out of control cell growth, which is considered to be cancer. And so if this cancer starts to grow and grow and grow, it'll manifest into what's known as melanoma, because the cells are brown, and it'll eventually, those cells will divide and divide and divide and actually breach the epidermis all the way to the top, to where you would actually see from the outside a big brown spot, and sometimes it can be even dark black. Now that can be possibly dangerous. If it turns out to be malignant, it can be extremely dangerous. And it's like, well, why is that? Because these cancer cells, these melanocytes from the melanoma, can even breach into the dermis and get into the blood vessels and then travel to other places of the body. This is something you don't want. So one way to protect yourself is put some sun lotion on the top like that, and that adds even more protection from the sun. So again, another photograph of the same thing. Here's a melanocyte. It has lots of melanin pigments. And what's interesting is, depending on your race, we all have the same number of melanocytes. It's just a matter of how much they're producing and the size of the granules. I find that to be kind of interesting. So we're all more similar than we would like to believe at times. But let there be no mistake. These pigments, these melanocytes, are really, really useful. You need this when the sunlight is coming down. The truth is, the darker your skin is, the better protected you are against the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And so that's rather important. And again, here's the layers of the epidermis. The epidermis is all of this right here, all the way down to the basement membrane. So all of these layers, the corneum and the luceum and the granulosum and the spinosum and the basal layer and the basement membrane, all of this is epidermis, and here's the dermis below, as shown here. And these are the melanocytes, which are sort of popping out where you can see them kind of brown in coloration. I was mentioning skin color. It's kind of an interesting graphic here. When you look at, if you draw the equator across, and you can clearly see that this is where the sun is coming down most directly. So individuals, in terms of their origin, of where their family are from, if they're from this area, clearly that they're adapted to that physicality of a lot of sun in that area, and so you get darker individuals in this area. It's a real advantage. When you have individuals coming up from these Scandinavian countries and moving down into areas closer to the equator, then you get into difficulty in terms of possible skin cancer. But skin cancer is more than just the melanocytes. It can result from environmental conditions as well. In other words, just simple exposure to the sun will cause the melanocytes, and you already know this, to start producing more melanin, and you get tan. And so you can darken your skin, but that's not going to last. So when those cells move further and further to the top, as I was describing earlier, those cells get sloughed off and then the tan fades. And then there's some physiological factors that affect skin color. In other words, simply becoming, when you're exercising and your blood vessels are dilating, your skin takes on kind of a reddish hue. And so there's a lot of things that are influencing skin color. So sunlight causes the skin to darken because more melanin is being produced. And again, circulation within the dermal blood vessels will also affect skin color. So now the dermis. Dermis is where it's all at in terms of like the real skin, the true skin, which is very active, and it has all kinds of collagen in here and elastin fibers. And one thing I wanted to connect is because the sun not only is potentially dangerous for skin cancer, but over the accumulation of one's life, the ultraviolet light, let me go like this, the ultraviolet light can strike these protein fibers, these collagen fibers, and actually affect their shape. which eventually weakens them and breaks them down. They're not as strong. And so therefore the dermis becomes not as youthful as it was in our early days of our lives. And thus, if the collagen starts to break down, the skin starts to buckle a little bit, and it sort of manifests into wrinkles. Now, I don't know really anyone who enjoys having wrinkles. So it's one of these things where you really got to protect yourself. And if you find yourself forgetting to put sunblock on, you've got to get into a routine, because I can see how you forget that. But if you get into a routine like brushing your teeth and combing your hair and grabbing your lotion and putting that on every single day, that's the way to roll. It's a very serious thing. And so dermal blood vessels down below here, you can see in red, they carry blood, and what's in the blood is nutrients, so sugars and amino acids, all kinds of hormones. And they also help to regulate the temperature. So I mentioned not only can they dilate, which will increase the blood flow, which will release heat, but they can constrict and make the skin turn pale. It's like you've ever seen someone, maybe you've looked at yourself and you're like, pale. Well, that means your blood vessels are constricting, and you can see just how much they're affecting the color. But in addition to the blood vessels, the dermis also contains all kinds of nerve endings, which are important, as I mentioned before, for feeling and sensation of touch. And then we have these big hair follicles right here, which is this shaft with the hair resides, the hair follicle. And then we have sebaceous glands, which are associated with the hair, which produce oil, called sebum. And then we have sweat glands, which are shown here, which produce water to the outside to help regulate our temperature. So down below the dermis, we have the subcutaneous, or hypodermis, and that's a very important layer as well, because it's composed of adipose tissue. So it helps us to cushion us, it helps to store energy, and it also helps us to be insulated, to make sure our temperature isn't, or the heat of our body isn't being radiated to the outside so easily. And so let's take a look at some of these accessory organs, and hair follicles are some of the more important ones. Here's a great micrograph of hair. You can see here it looks a little bit like a blonde hair right here, not a lot of melanin. And down below at the base of the hair follicle, now remember the hair follicle is considered to be part of the epidermis. So we're already past the dermis, and now we're getting into the subcutaneous. Notice the adipose tissue here. This is from the scalp. And so this is where the cells are dividing, right in here. So hairs can be found almost everywhere in the skin. And so again, this is the cells that are dividing, and as they move upward, they die. And so I don't know if you've seen these commercials on television about how certain shampoo is like diffusing into the hair, and the hair is like, oh, I love it. In fact, the hair that isn't influenced at all, it doesn't obtain anything from, as far as nutrient, it doesn't help the hair grow. It's your diet, the things that you eat, will affect that. Like the protein in your blood from your food that you're eating will supply the cells down below. That's for sure. What shampoo is doing is that it's washing off the oil, which is lubricating the hair shaft, and that oil accumulates on the hair, and also like dust and dirt will get on it as well. And soap, shampoo being a detergent, is part polar and non-polar, and helps to wash away the oils from the hair, so that's useful. So individual hair follicles can penetrate deeply. You can see here in the subcutaneous area. It's kind of interesting. So again, another shot. You can see here that the follicle is clearly part of the epidermis, and this dermal papillae right in here are the cells that are actively dividing. What's extremely curious to many physicians is that these cells in certain individuals will stop growing in a phenomenon called hair loss. And it's fascinating because in certain individuals, hair will stop growing in certain areas. And like, for example, in males, it's more common. And so you got to wonder about that. What's causing the hair follicle to stop growing? It could be hormonal. It could be, for example, testosterone causing this to occur. But what's interesting is testosterone has interesting effects. It will cause hair to grow, like for example on your chin or on your face or on your underarm and pubic hairs, but it will cause other hairs to not grow, like on the scalp. So it's kind of curious. And so a lot of research is done on hair growth because it could be potentially a $1 billion industry if we were able to come up with something that really promoted hair growth effectively. There are a few drugs on the market that will do a little bit of hair growth. We noticed that there's a topical agent that when supplied to the scalp, and you might be familiar with some of these brand names, but it was discovered as a indirect sort of side effect of a medicine that suppresses your immune system. And so what's interesting is one of the ideas, the hypothesis about this is that our own white blood cells are starting to hurt the dermal papilla cells, and therefore the follicle dies and then the hair is lost. So it's a combination of sort of testosterone and immune system. It's very curious. A lot more research needs to be done in hair growth. But as I was saying, the cells fill up with keratin, and so these cells up here are dead. And so the hair shaft itself is dead. They're just layers and layers of epidermal cells, which form this. And so you can see it like this with the scanning electron micrograph like this. These are the keratinized squamous cells that are coming up. And this is some, I don't know what that is. That's like some sort of other squamous cell tissue that's clinging on the hair follicle, the hair shaft. What's fascinating about this, I mentioned this before, is that in the dermis we have this muscle, it's smooth muscle called the Erector Pili muscle. It's shown right here. Here's a cutaway of the hair in the hair follicle, right here, the hair. This is a cross-section of the sebaceous gland that surrounds the hair follicle that produces oil, right over here. But what I'm getting at is the fact that when this Erector Pili muscle pushes up on the follicle, it causes our hair to stand up in like goosebumps. And we all know that we get goosebumps when we're cold. And so what the thought is if the hair rises up like this, it'll trap the hair, sort of like fluffing a down comforter. When it's all fluffed up like that, the feathers in the comforter will keep the heat better and closer to your body. It'll retain heat, and therefore you'll stay warm. It's not that effective though, because we really just don't have that much hair. And it's also when we're frightened, and again, that could possibly be a response in other organisms to looking more threatened when they're, or more threatening when they're being attacked. Sometimes, like for example, if you own a cat, you'll know what I'm talking about, that sort of it arches up and its hair puffs out a little bit as a result of that. And so that's the result of the Erector Pili muscle in the dermis. And brown is not the only color. We also have some red pigments as well. This is a cool picture that I found. This is a stained glass window of a hair follicle. I don't know. It's pretty interesting. Here's the Erector Pili muscle. That's pretty good. And here's the sebaceous gland. So red hair is caused by red pigments in addition to the brown pigments. And so there's a lot of different hair colors that we can experience. It's not just one thing or the other, which is suggestive of the fact that there's multiple genes involved in this. When you see a gradual continuum of hair color, not either or, it means that it's many genes involved, many pigments, and it's considered to be polygenic. So these sebaceous glands that I've been kicking around are cells, simple cuboidal cells that secrete oil called sebum that helps to waterproof and moisten the hair shaft. And so the oil comes up and it lubricates the hair. And as you know, some people have a lot of oil on their skin and also on their hair, but it's called sebum, and the sebaceous glands are the ones that are producing it. Now the thing is, oil and the lipids of the sebaceous gland are, a great nutrient. It's sort of like everybody loves like greasy kinds of food, like potato chips and French fries and things. So occasionally bacteria will get inside the hair shaft, and it'll come down in here and start to have a picnic with this sebum and start growing and growing and growing. And the bacteria will grow and grow and grow, and then more and more blood vessels in the dermis will dilate, bringing in more white blood cells to fight off the infection, which creates a lot of lymph in the area, which is this sort of whitish fluid that's found in our lymphatic capillaries. And so you get this big mass, and eventually this infection results in an inflammation called acne, and it sort of manifests as a red bubble on the top of the skin, and sometimes it's filled with this pus. And so one way to treat that is with antibiotics, or just simply washing your skin with soap and water is important. Sometimes you just can't control it, because what's interesting is when all of us reached puberty in our lives, those reproductive hormones that are released affect hair follicles and hair growth, and they also affect the production of the sebaceous glands. And so there's a kind of an abnormal increase of sebum, and it results in acne during puberty. And so that's what that happened. This is a great photograph here of the gland, which are cells that secrete the sebum, and here's a sort of a cutaway of the hair right there, so the sebaceous gland. And again, another micrograph showing here's the hair follicle right here, and here's the dermal papilla cells, and all this white tissue associated with the hair follicle right here is the sebaceous gland. And so what's interesting is we also have nails, and nails are accessory organs as well, and they play a protective role. They also help us to be able to pick things up, and in other organisms other than humans, they can be rather important in terms of defense and holding on. And so they're protective coverings of our fingers and our toes. And what's interesting about it is they're extensions of epidermal cells, and they're all dead. So the nail's dead. You probably know that, and it's filled with the protein keratin. And so this layer, this white area on the bottom that sort of looks like a half moon, called the lugula. It's really difficult to pronounce, so it's lugula, if I'm pronouncing that right. Lugula is this sort of half moon like Luna. And these are the cells that are dividing and moving upward right here. And so as the new cells are produced, the old ones get moved up. And then, ultimately we'll want to cut these. And so sweat glands, I mentioned before, are found in the dermis, but there's ducts that lead to the outside. A gland that produces something that leads to the outside is called an exocrine. Gland, exocrine, to the outside as opposed to endocrine. And this is secreting saline, so salt water, to the outside. Again, I mentioned this, when we're really warm, the warmest water molecules are the ones that are evaporating first, called evaporative cooling, leaving the cooler ones behind, and therefore a feeling of cooling in general. And so sweat helps us to regulate body temperature, as well as just simply shivering can help us to warm. In other words, the contraction of our muscles and blood vessels dilating can also help to regulate blood temperature. So dilation or constriction of blood vessels, or sweating or not sweating, and shivering are all things in which we can control our temperature, basically. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit more about skin cancer. I was saying that skin cancer are cells that grow out of control. And so what's difficult is that it's our own cells. And so it's not like a bacteria or a virus where we could fight it with an antibiotic. These are our own cells. And so if the cells grow out of control, it's considered to be a tumor. But the tumor could be benign, meaning that it's not as dangerous if it's limited to just a few cell layers and it's not invading so much into the tissues below or above it. And so more to come on what we mean by invading other tissues. But if the tumor were to spread and become troublesome in terms of like going to different locations in the body, then it's considered to be malignant or cancerous, which is very dangerous. So again, these malignant tumors are the ones that are out of control and that are very dangerous, and the others are benign, not as dangerous. And so the term that we like to use for spreading is metastasize. And so when it spreads to different parts of the body and starts new tumors, it's considered to be metastasized. And so skin cancer that spreads to, you're like, well, how can the skin hurt me? Well, if these cells spread to the brain or the lung or the liver and start crowding out some of those cells, there can be big trouble, it can be fatal. So briefly, so I didn't mean to do that. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that either. One of the things that I wanted to mention is this whole idea of how do you determine whether or not a mole, for example, on your skin is skin cancer. And so I would advise you to check out some websites on this other than this. But in general, this is the A, B, C, Ds of skin cancer identification. If your mole is asymmetric, meaning that it's sort of over on this side, it looks a little darker than over here, that it's not consistent on both sides. So symmetric would be that it's similar on both sides if you were to cut it in half. So if the asymmetry is off, that's a cause for concern. If the borders are slightly irregular, so in other words, it's not round, it's kind of jaggedy, that's a cause for concern. If the color is really dark, that's a cause for concern. And if the diameter, which is the overall cross of the mole, is more than, say, the diameter of a pencil eraser, that could be cause for trouble as well. So these would be some of the signs that you want to go in to a dermatologist and have it checked out. So I hope you enjoyed this video look at the integumentary system. Thanks for watching.